Okay, so today we are going to take a deep dive into procrastination. And I'm guessing you're all pretty familiar with this topic. But the good news is you're not alone. I think we all have those moments where like cleaning out the fridge suddenly seems like a much better use of time than that looming deadline.
Oh, absolutely.
But here's the thing, procrastination, it's not just about laziness or poor time management. There's a whole lot of fascinating science behind it. And that's what we're going to unpack today. So we've got some really insightful research exploring not only why we procrastinate, but also, and this is the important part, how we can actually outsmart those procrastination impulses.
Right. And it all starts with understanding, what's happening in our brains when we procrastinate.
Yeah.
It's like there's a constant tug of war going on
Mm.
between the emotional part of our brain, which is the amygdala, and the more logical planning part, which is called the prefrontal cortex.
So it's like an internal battle of wills. No wonder it feels so exhausting sometimes.
Exactly. And to make matters even more complicated, there's this whole dopamine reward system at play. Our brains are wired to seek pleasure and avoid pain. So that rush of dopamine you get from, say, scrolling through social media, that actually reinforces that procrastination cycle.
That makes so much sense. It's like my brain is choosing the instant gratification of like a funny meme over the, less immediate, but ultimately, more rewarding feeling of accomplishment from finishing a task.
Right. And procrastination is particularly tricky, I think, because it often stems from a stress response. So, when we feel overwhelmed or anxious about a task, our emotional brain kind of takes over. It's trying to protect us by pushing the task away. It seems procrastination as a solution, even though we know logically it's only making things worse in the long run.
This reminds me of that classic example of like students pulling all-nighters before exams. Like they know of the it's not healthy or effective. But the stress of the exam makes them delay studying until the very last minute.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really crucial point. Procrastination isn't just about missed deadlines or a few extra gray hairs. The consequences can actually be far more serious than we realize.
Yeah, we all know procrastination leads to stress, but I'm guessing there's more to it than that.
Absolutely. Chronic procrastination has been linked to a whole host of physical and mental health issues. For example, those all-nighters we were just talking about. Sleep deprivation doesn't just make you feel groggy. It actually shrinks the hippocampus, which is a crucial area of the brain for memory formation.
Wow, so it's like my brain is actually sabotaging itself in the long run. That's a pretty powerful incentive to break the cycle.
It is, and the good news is,
Huh.
even though our brains are wired for instant gratification, they're also incredibly adaptable. We can rewire those procrastination patterns with the right strategies and a little bit of effort.
Okay, so that's what I'm really curious about. Like, what can we actually do to break free from this procrastination trap? Let's get into the nitty-gritty of those actionable strategies.
One of the most effective approaches is to simply start by acknowledging those procrastination triggers. The research that you provided actually highlights some really common ones, like fear of failure, perfectionism, or feeling overwhelmed by the task itself.
Those definitely resonate. I know I've personally fallen prey to all of those at some point,
Yeah.
but simply recognizing them, is that enough?
It's a great first step, because once you know your triggers, you can start to develop strategies to manage them. For example, if you tend to procrastinate because you're afraid of failing, try breaking the task down into smaller, more manageable steps.
So instead of staring at a blank page and thinking, I'll never write this entire essay, I can focus on just writing the introduction first.
Exactly. Suddenly it feels less daunting.
Yeah.
And speaking of making things less daunting, there's this great strategy called the 2-minute rule. If a task takes less than 2 minutes, do it and no bu.
That's interesting, but isn't that just another form of procrastination, like putting off the bigger task by focusing on these tiny things?
It might seem counterintuitive, but it's actually about building momentum, not about completing your entire to-do list in 2-minute increments. Those small wins create a sense of accomplishment and get you moving in the right direction. Think of it like clearing your mental desktop.
Okay, I'm starting to see how those little actions can add up. It's like instead of feeling overwhelmed by a mountain of tasks, I'm taking those first few steps, clearing a path forward.
Exactly. And once you've got that momentum, it's about creating an environment that supports focus and productivity. So turn off those phone notifications, find a quiet space, and maybe even try tools like the Pomodoro technique, which alternates between focused work sessions and short breaks.
I've heard of the Pomodoro technique, but I've never really tried it. Is it really that effective?
It can be incredibly helpful. For people who struggle to stay focused for long periods of time, it's all about working with your brain's natural rhythms, not against them.
That's a great point, because ultimately this isn't about forcing ourselves to work for hours on end. It's about finding strategies that work with our brains, not against them.
Exactly. And that's where understanding your why comes in. Connecting the task to a bigger goal or reward can be a powerful motivator.
So if I'm struggling to find the motivation to clean my apartment, instead of focusing on the chore itself, I might think about how good it will feel to relax in a tidy space later.
Precisely. Or if you're dreading studying for an exam, remind yourself that it's a step towards your dream career. Finding that personal meaning behind the task can make all the difference.
It's like shifting your focus from the immediate discomfort to the long-term reward. But even with the best intentions, sometimes those negative thoughts creep in, like, I'll never finish this, or it's too hard, blah, blah, blah. What do we do about those inner critics?
That's where mindfulness comes in. It's about learning to observe those thoughts without judgment, to create a little space between you and that inner critic.
Okay, mindfulness, I've heard it's helpful, but I'll admit I've always been a bit skeptical. Is it really more than just, sitting on a cushion and chanting?
It's definitely more than that. Mindfulness is a practice, and it takes time to develop. But the benefits can be incredible, especially when it comes to managing those negative thought patterns that fuel procrastination.
So it's about becoming more aware of those thoughts, but not letting them control us.
That's the goal. And with practice, you can start to choose which thoughts to engage with and which ones to let go of. It's like building a mental muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
That's a great analogy. It's like we're training our brains to focus on the present moment, rather than getting caught up in worries about the future or regrets about the past.
Exactly. And that present moment focus can be incredibly helpful when it comes to overcoming procrastination. Because so often it's those worries about the future or those what ifs that keep us from taking action in the first place.
This is all making a lot of sense. But I'm realizing that we've been talking about procrastination as if it's this enemy to be conquered. But isn't there a flip side to this? Could there be times when procrastination actually serves us?
That's a fascinating question, and one that deserves further exploration. Because you're right, not all procrastination is created equal. Sometimes it can actually be a sign that we need to reevaluate our priorities, or that we're not fully aligned with the task at hand.
That's a great point. It's like maybe instead of forcing ourselves to power through, we should listen to that procrastination impulse and ask ourselves, is this really something I need to be doing right now?
Exactly. Sometimes procrastination can be a signal that we need to take a step back, reassess, and maybe even make some changes.
Okay, that's a whole new perspective. I think we need to unpack that a bit further. But before we do, let's take a moment to recap what we've covered so far.
Okay, so we started by diving into the brain science behind procrastination, exploring the role of the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and the dopamine reward system.
Right. And we learned that while procrastination might offer that temporary relief from stress or boredom, it can actually have some pretty significant long-term consequences for our well-being.
Absolutely, and that's why we explored a range of strategies for overcoming procrastination,
Mm-hmm.
from breaking tasks down into smaller steps to understanding our triggers, creating a focus-friendly environment, and even embracing the power of mindfulness.
We also started to touch upon the idea that not all procrastination is bad, and that sometimes it can actually be a valuable signal, that we need to reevaluate our priorities or approach.
That's a key insight and one that we'll delve into more deeply when we return. So welcome back. Before we dig deeper into the idea of this, positive procrastination, I want to kind of circle back to something we touched upon earlier, the power of habits. Because let's be honest, even with all the best strategies and all the, best intentions in the world, sometimes it feels like we're fighting this uphill battle against our own brains, right?
No, absolutely. I think we've all had those moments where we know what we should be doing, but somehow we just can't seem to make ourselves do it. Like, my rational brain understands that exercise is good for me, but my actual behavior, often tells a very different story.
Right. And that's where understanding the science of habit formation can be so helpful. Because the truth is, willpower alone is often not enough. We need to create systems that support our goals and make those desired behaviors more automatic.
Okay, so let's get practical. What are some concrete examples of these habit-building systems? Because I think a lot of people struggle with, turning those good intentions into lasting change.
Yeah, one powerful technique is to simply, schedule regular times for specific tasks, just like you would schedule a meeting or a doctor's appointment. This works especially well for things we tend to put off. like exercise or writing or even just cleaning.
So instead of saying I'll work out sometime this week, I'd actually block off, say, Tuesday and Thursday evenings for a gym session.
Yeah.
No excuses.
Exactly. It takes the decision-making out of the equation. At 6 p.m. on Tuesday, you know exactly what you're doing. No more mental back and forth or negotiating with your inner couch potato.
I like it. It's like by scheduling it in, I'm making a commitment to myself, and it's harder to back out when it's like staring me in the face on my calendar.
That's the idea. And over time, as you repeat those scheduled actions, they become more automatic, less tied to motivation or willpower. You're literally building new neural pathways, making those behaviors more ingrained.
So it's not just about like forcing myself to do something I don't want to do. It's about actually changing my brain's wiring so that those positive behaviors become more, natural, more effortless over time.
Precisely. And another powerful habit-building strategy that I find particularly helpful is what's called temptation bundling. It's basically pairing something you should do with something you want to do.
Okay, I'm intrigued, but I need a real world example here. Paint me a picture.
Okay, let's say you love listening to podcasts, but you keep putting off those dreaded expense reports. Temptation bundling would be allowing yourself to only listen to your favorite podcast while you're doing those expense reports.
Oh, I see. So it's like I'm bribing my brain with something pleasurable to like get through the less enjoyable task.
Exactly. You're using the thing you want to do as a reward
Yeah.
for doing the thing you need to do. And because you're associating that, less desirable task with something enjoyable, it becomes less daunting over time.
That's brilliant. It's like tricking my brain into cooperating, and I can see how this could apply to so many areas of life. Like maybe I only allow myself to watch my favorite show while I'm folding laundry or something.
Exactly. It's all about getting creative and finding those little hacks that work for you. And remember, habit building is a process, not a destination.
Hmm.
It takes time and consistency, and there will inevitably be slip-ups along the way.
So true. It's like learning any new skill.
Right.
There will be those days when I nail it and those days when I fall flat on my face. But the important thing is to keep practicing, keep refining those strategies, and not beat myself up when I inevitably stumble.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And speaking of not beating yourself up, I think it's important to acknowledge the role of self-compassion in all of this. Because, I think one of the biggest reasons people struggle with procrastination is that they're incredibly hard on themselves when they inevitably fall short.
Oh, for sure. The shame spiral can be brutal. I know I've been there. You procrastinate, then you feel guilty and frustrated with yourself, which makes you even less likely to tackle the task and so on. It's a vicious cycle.
It is, and that's why cultivating self-compassion is so essential. It's about recognizing that procrastination is a human thing, not a personal failing. We all do it sometimes, and it doesn't mean we're lazy or incompetent or unworthy.
Easier said than done, though, right? Because in those moments of self-flagellation, it's hard to access that self-compassion. It's like my inner critic has a much louder voice than my inner cheerleader.
It definitely takes practice, but one helpful approach is to simply talk to yourself. The way you would talk to a good friend who is struggling. Would you berate them and call them names and tell them they're a failure? Or would you offer kindness and support and encouragement?
That's a great point. I would never speak to a friend the way I sometimes speak to myself. It's like I have this double standard when it comes to self-compassion.
It's a common pattern, but one that we can change with awareness and effort. And remember, progress, not perfection. Some days will be better than others. The key is to approach it with a growth mindset, focusing on learning from those slip-ups rather than dwelling on them.
So instead of beating myself up for procrastinating on that workout, I might ask myself, what could I have done differently? What can I learn from this for next time? How can I set myself up for success tomorrow?
Exactly. It's about turning those moments into opportunities for growth, rather than letting them derail your progress. And speaking of setting yourself up for success, let's talk about the importance of creating a supportive environment. Because even with the best intentions and the strongest habits, if our environment is constantly working against us, it's going to be an uphill battle.
That makes so much sense. It's like trying to eat healthy when your fridge is stocked with junk food. No matter how motivated I am, I'm going to be tempted. So how do we create those procrastination-proof environments?
Well, it starts with identifying your biggest distractions. Is it social media, email, that pile of laundry calling your name? Once you know your weaknesses, you can start to address them.
So if social media is my kryptonite, maybe I need to delete those apps during my work hours or use a website blocker to prevent myself from going down those rabbit holes.
Exactly, and it's not about becoming some kind of productivity robot who never allows themselves any fun or distractions. It's about setting boundaries and creating clear delineations between work time and leisure time.
I love that because I think sometimes we feel like we need to be on all the time, constantly connected and available. But that kind of constant stimulation can be exhausting
Hmm.
and ultimately counterproductive.
It absolutely can. That's why it's so important to build in those breaks, those moments of downtime where you can disconnect and recharge, and give your brain a chance to rest and reset.
Okay, so we've talked about building habits, creating a supportive environment, and being kind to ourselves when we inevitably slip up. But I'm curious, what about the role of other people in all of this? Can we leverage relationships to help us overcome procrastination?
Absolutely. And one of the most effective ways to do this is through accountability partnerships.
Hmm.
It's basically finding someone who shares similar goals and then checking in with each other regularly on your progress.
That's like having a built-in cheerleader and a nudge in the right direction all rolled into one.
Exactly. Knowing that someone else is aware of your goals and expecting you to follow through can be a huge motivator. Plus, it's an opportunity to share tips and celebrate successes and offer support when things get tough.
I can see how that would be so helpful. It's like having someone to share the journey with, to keep you motivated and on track when you inevitably hit those bumps in the road.
Precisely. And accountability partners don't have to be formal or overly structured. It could be as simple as texting a friend each morning with your top 3 priorities for the day, or meeting up once a week to discuss your progress and challenges.
That's great advice. I think we often underestimate the power of simply talking things through, of having someone to bounce ideas off of, and to help us stay accountable.
Absolutely. And sometimes just having that external validation and support can make all the difference in the world.
Okay, so we've talked about habit building supportive environments, self compassion, and accountability partners. Is there anything else we should consider as we kind of wrap up this section on strategies?
One final piece I'd like to touch upon is the power of positive self-talk. Because let's be honest, our inner critic can be a real procrastination gremlin.
Oh, tell me about it. I swear mine has a PhD in negativity.
Right. And the thing is, those negative thoughts can become self-fulfilling prophecies. If we're constantly telling ourselves, I'm terrible at this, or I'll never get it done,
Yeah.
we're setting ourselves up for failure.
It's like those thoughts create this mental block, this resistance to even starting the task.
Exactly. But the good news is we can retrain our brains
Yeah.
to focus on more positive and empowering messages. So instead of, I'm terrible at this, try, I'm learning and growing, instead of, I'll never get it done, try, I can take it one step at a time. Or, I'm capable of figuring this out.
So it's about consciously choosing those thoughts that support our goals, rather than the ones that hold us back.
Precisely, it takes practice. But the more you do it, the easier it becomes. It's like building a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. And the stronger your positive self-talk muscle becomes, the less power those negative thoughts will have over you.
This reminds me of that saying, whether you think you can or you think you can't. You're right. It's like by shifting our self-talk, we're actually changing our beliefs about ourselves and our capabilities, which in turn impacts our actions and ultimately our results.
Beautifully said, it's all interconnected. Our thoughts, our beliefs, our actions, and our results
Yeah.
all influence each other. And by consciously choosing more positive and empowering thoughts, we can create this positive upward spiral that propels us towards our goals.
I love that, a positive upward spiral. And I think that's a perfect segue into our final section, where we'll explore the flip side of procrastination. Those times when delaying a task might actually be the smartest move.
Sounds good to me.
Let's dive in.
So, he spent a lot of time talking about all the ways procrastination can sabotage our goals and our well-being.
Right.
But, before we wrap up this deep dive, I'm really curious to explore this idea we touched upon earlier, that maybe, just maybe, procrastination isn't always the villain it's made out to be.
It's a great point, and one that I think deserves more attention. Because, while chronic procrastination can definitely be detrimental, there are times when delaying a task might actually be the smartest move. It all comes down to intention and awareness.
Okay. I'm all ears. Convince me that procrastination can be a good thing.
Well, think about it this way. Sometimes procrastination can be a signal that we need to reevaluate our priorities, or that we're not fully aligned with the task at hand. Maybe we're feeling overwhelmed. Maybe we're not truly passionate about the project. Or maybe we're just not in the right headspace to tackle it effectively.
That really resonates with me. I've definitely been times when I've felt this immense pressure to get something done, but deep down I knew it wasn't the right time or the right approach. And that internal conflict, that resistance, often manifested as procrastination.
Exactly. And instead of beating ourselves up for procrastinating, we can actually use those moments as opportunities for reflection. Ask yourself, why am I resisting this task? What's really going on here? Maybe it's a sign that you need to delegate or renegotiate deadlines or even scrap the project altogether if it's not truly serving you.
That's such a powerful shift in perspective. Instead of seeing procrastination as a failure of willpower, we can reframe it as valuable feedback, as an invitation to check in with ourselves and make sure we're on the right track.
Precisely. And sometimes procrastination can actually lead to greater creativity and innovation. When we allow our minds to wander, to make those unexpected connections, we often come up with our best ideas. There's a reason why so many aha moments happen in the shower or while taking a walk. It's those moments of relaxed attention when we're not forcing ourselves to focus that allow our brains to make those creative leaps.
That's so interesting. So it's like by giving ourselves permission to step away from the task, to let our minds wander, we're actually creating the conditions for those breakthrough insights to emerge.
Exactly. And I
Yeah.
think that's a crucial distinction to make. There's a difference between passive procrastination, where we're just mindlessly scrolling through social media or binge watching Netflix, and what some researchers call active procrastination, where we're intentionally engaging in other activities that allow our minds to rest and recharge.
Okay, I love that distinction, active procrastination. It's like instead of beating myself up for not working on that report, I might go for a walk in nature or listen to some inspiring music, knowing that those activities are actually fueling my creativity and ultimately making me more productive in the long run.
Exactly. It's about being intentional and mindful about how we spend our time,
Mm.
even when we're not directly working on a task. I think that brings us to a really important point about self-awareness. The more we understand our own procrastination patterns, the better equipped we are to make conscious choices about, when to push through and when to step back.
That makes so much sense. It's like once we understand our own triggers, our own rhythms, and our own unique ways of working, we can start to leverage those insights to create a more productive and fulfilling work life. And maybe, just maybe, we can even learn to embrace procrastination, at least in its active and intentional form, as a valuable tool in our creative arsenal.
Absolutely. It's all about finding that balance, that sweet spot, where we're challenging ourselves to grow and push beyond our comfort zones, but also honoring our own needs, our own rhythms, and our own unique ways of working.
This has been such an insightful conversation. I feel like I've gained a whole new perspective on procrastination. It's not just this black and white, good versus evil kind of thing. It's much more nuanced than that.
I agree. And I think the more we can embrace that nuance, the more we can empower ourselves to make conscious choices about how we manage our energy and our creative processes.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into procrastination, I'm left with this kind of thought-provoking question for our listeners. We've talked a lot about individual strategies for managing procrastination, but I'm curious, could there be societal factors that contribute to this widespread struggle? Like, does our always-on, hyper-connected culture make it even harder to focus, to prioritize, and to resist those constant distractions?
That's a fantastic question, and one that I think warrants further exploration. Because you're right, we live in a world that's constantly vying for our attention,
Right.
bombarding us with notifications and emails and updates, and it's no wonder that so many of us feel overwhelmed and scattered, and pulled in a million different directions.
It's like our brains are constantly being hijacked by those external demands, making it even harder to connect with our own internal compass, our own sense of what truly matters.
Absolutely. And I think it's more important than ever to cultivate those mindfulness practices, those boundaries, those self-care rituals that allow us to reclaim our attention, to reconnect with our values, and to make conscious choices about how we spend our precious time and energy.
Beautifully said. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into procrastination. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. I hope this conversation has sparked some new insights and inspired you to approach procrastination with a little more curiosity, a little more self-compassion, and maybe even a little bit of strategic embrace. Until next time, happy hustling, or maybe happy procrastinating. Just make sure it's the active kind.